They told the German women they were about to die. Every single one of them believed it. How could they not? For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as savage monsters, beasts who would strip prisoners naked, beat them bloody, and leave them to rot. When hundreds of Wehrmacht auxiliaries, the Helferinnen, were herded into American processing centers in the spring of 1945, they prepared for torture. They prepared for death. Instead, American medics gave them warm baths, not cold hoses, not humiliation, steaming water, gentle hands, bars of soap that smelled like flowers. The women stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Enemy soldiers were treating their wounds, washing their hair, wrapping them in clean towels. It was the opposite of everything they'd been promised, and it broke them in ways that cruelty never could. This is what happened when terror met kindness. May 1945. Europe's war was finally over. Church bells rang across the shattered continent. Crowds danced in the streets. But for the young women standing in long lines outside American military installations, there was no celebration, only fear. They were the Helferinnen, female helpers of the Wehrmacht. Secretaries, telephone operators, radio technicians, nurses. Some had manned anti-aircraft searchlights that cut through night skies. Others had typed orders that sent men to their deaths. Most were barely out of their teens, faces still soft despite years of total war. Now their uniforms hung in tatters. Their boots were cracked, caked with mud from weeks of retreat. Their hair was matted, unwashed, crawling with lice. They hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. They hadn't slept without the sound of artillery in months. And they had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to them. The processing center was a converted military base in Western Germany. Barbed wire surrounded rows of hastily constructed buildings. Guard towers loomed at each corner. American soldiers with rifles stood watch, faces impossible to read. To the German women shuffling forward in line, this place looked exactly like what they'd been taught to fear. A prison. A death camp. The end. But then something strange happened. The smell hit them first. Not the stench of death they expected, but something else entirely. Coffee. Real coffee, rich and dark, drifting from inside the compound. And underneath it, the unmistakable aroma of frying meat. The women exchanged confused glances. Was this some kind of trick? Were the Americans cooking their last meal before the executions began? A young woman named Helga stood near the front of the line. She was barely 19. For years, she'd been a telephone operator at military headquarters in Berlin, connecting calls between generals until the very end. Now her hands, which had spent years pressing buttons and switching cables, trembled at her sides. She'd seen her city burn. She'd heard the final orders, the desperate commands, the silence when there was nothing left to command. And now she was here, waiting for whatever came next. The line moved slowly. With each step forward, the women's terror grew. They whispered to each other in hushed German, sharing rumors from the chaotic final days of the Reich. "The Americans will make us dig our own graves," said one pale girl from Hamburg. "I heard they give women to the soldiers," whispered another, voice cracking. "For entertainment. Better the Americans than the Russians," muttered a hardened searchlight operator who'd survived 3 years of Allied bombing raids. "At least it will be quick." No one argued with her. They'd all heard stories about what was happening in the East, where Soviet forces were extracting brutal revenge. The Americans might be monsters, but surely they couldn't be worse than that. When Helga reached the front of the line, an American soldier looked at her with tired eyes. He was young, maybe 20, with sandy hair and freckles covering his face. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He pointed toward the building and said something in English. Helga didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and walked forward into the unknown. Each footfall felt like walking toward her own execution. Inside the building, Helga's eyes adjusted to the light. She'd expected darkness. Instead, she found a large, well-lit room filled with tables and medical equipment. American personnel moved efficiently between stations, most wearing white coats, doctors, Nurses, medics, not executioners. A woman in a crisp American uniform approached. She spoke in accented but clear German, voice calm and professional. "Please remove your clothing and place it in this bag. You will receive clean clothes after processing." Helga's blood ran cold. This was it. The humiliation. The degradation. She'd heard stories about what happened to women forced to undress in front of enemy soldiers. Her hands shook as she began to unbutton her ragged uniform jacket. Around her, other German women were doing the same, faces tight with shame and fear. Some were crying silently. Others had gone completely blank, retreating into themselves to escape what was about to happen. But what happened next was not what any of them expected. Once undressed, the women were guided into a separate area by female American personnel. There were no male soldiers present, no leering eyes, no cruel laughter. Instead, there were medical professionals who examined each woman with clinical efficiency, checking for wounds, infections, signs of disease. They were thorough but respectful, explaining each procedure in broken German or through translators. "We need to check for lice," one American nurse explained gently to Helga, examining her scalp. "Almost everyone who comes through has them. It's not your fault. War does this to people." Helga was stunned. The nurse was being kind. Actually kind. Not the false kindness that preceded cruelty, but genuine human warmth. She didn't know how to respond. After the medical examination, the women were led to the showering station. This was the moment they'd dreaded most. They'd heard rumors about showers, rumors about gas chambers disguised as bathing facilities, rumors about chemicals that burned skin. As they approached the tiled room with its rows of showerheads, several women began to sob openly. One collapsed to her knees, begging in German for mercy. An American medic knelt beside the fallen woman. He was young, with dark hair and gentle eyes. He didn't speak German, but his voice was soft as he helped her to her feet. Through a translator, he said, "It's only water, warm water and soap. I promise you won't be harmed." The showers were real showers. Hot water cascaded down from the ceiling, steam rising in the tiled room. The women were handed thick bars of white soap that smelled faintly of lavender. After months of washing with harsh lye soap or nothing at all, the American soap felt like silk against their skin. Some women stood frozen under the water, unable to process what was happening. Others scrubbed themselves frantically as if trying to wash away not just the dirt, but the memories of everything they'd endured. Helga stood under the hot spray and felt something inside her crack. Not break, not yet, but crack. The water was so warm. The soap smelled so clean. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt human. She had no idea what was happening anymore. After the showers, female medics helped the women dry off with soft towels. They applied medicated powder to prevent lice from returning. They treated wounds that had gone unattended for weeks. They bandaged blistered feet and applied ointment to cracked, bleeding hands. One medic spent 20 minutes carefully untangling a young woman's hair, which had become so matted it was nearly solid. "Why are you doing this?" the young woman asked in halting English. The medic smiled. "Because you're a human being, and human beings deserve to be treated like human beings." The young woman burst into tears. Clean and dressed in fresh clothes, simple cotton dresses and undergarments provided by the Americans, the women were led to a mess hall. The smell that hit them when they entered was almost overwhelming. Food. Real food. More food than most of them had seen in years. The serving line stretched along one wall. Behind the counter, American cooks ladled out portions of beef stew thick with chunks of real meat. There were mashed potatoes glistening with butter, green beans that weren't wilted or gray, slices of white bread, soft and fresh, not the hard black sawdust bread they'd been eating for months. There was coffee, real coffee with sugar and cream, and for dessert, there was something most of the women hadn't tasted since before the war. Chocolate cake. The women moved through the line in stunned silence. They accepted their trays like sleepwalkers, unable to believe what they were seeing. Some stared at the food as if it might disappear. Others looked around frantically, waiting for the trap to spring shut. Helga sat down at a table with her tray and simply stared at it. The stew was steaming. The bread was soft. The cake was dark and rich. She hadn't eaten anything like this since 1942. During the final months of the war, her ration had been watery turnip soup and bread that was more sawdust than flour. She'd lost so much weight that her uniform had hung on her like a sack. Slowly, carefully, she picked up her spoon and took a bite of the stew. The flavor exploded on her tongue. Beef, carrots, onions, salt, pepper. Herbs she couldn't name. It was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. Tears began to stream down her face, but she didn't stop eating. She couldn't stop. Her body was crying out for nourishment, and she shoveled the food into her mouth with desperate urgency. Around her, other women were having the same reaction. Some ate in silence, tears rolling down their cheeks. Others laughed hysterically between bites, overwhelmed by the absurdity of it all. A few refused to touch the food at first, convinced it must be poisoned. But as they watched their companions eat without ill effect, hunger eventually overcame fear. This couldn't be real. But it was. One woman, a gaunt former nurse from Dresden, looked up from her plate and said to no one in particular, "My little brother is eating grass in a field somewhere, and here I am eating beef stew and chocolate cake." Her voice was flat, empty. What kind of world is this? No one answered her. There was no answer to give. The chocolate cake was almost too much, rich, dark, sweet, beyond anything they'd experienced in years. Some women couldn't bring themselves to eat it. They wrapped it in napkins and hid it in their pockets, planning to save it for later. Others devoured it immediately, closing their eyes as the sweetness melted on their tongues, transported back to childhood birthday parties and holidays that seemed like another lifetime. After the meal, the women were led to their barracks. The buildings were simple wooden structures, hastily constructed but solid. Inside, rows of bunk beds lined the walls, each made up with clean sheets, wool blankets, and actual pillows. The floors had been swept clean. Windows let in late afternoon light. There was even a small stove in the corner for heat. The women stood in the doorway and stared. Most of them had been sleeping in cellars, ditches, and bombed-out buildings for months. Some hadn't slept in a real bed since the beginning of the war. The sight of clean sheets and pillows was almost more shocking than the food had been. "This can't be real," whispered one woman. "If it is a dream," replied another, "I don't want to wake up." They were assigned beds and given time to settle in before lights out. The women explored their new quarters with wonder, touching the blankets, pressing their faces into the pillows, marveling at the simple luxury of a clean floor. Some discovered that they'd been given small personal kits containing a toothbrush, toothpaste, a comb, and a small mirror. Items that seemed so ordinary, so mundane, but that most of them hadn't possessed in years. One woman sat on the edge of her bunk and slowly opened the personal kit. She held the toothbrush in her hands and began to weep. It had been months since she'd brushed her teeth properly. And now, here was a toothbrush. Here was toothpaste. Here was the possibility of feeling human again. That night, as darkness fell and the barracks grew quiet, the women lay in their bunks and tried to process what had happened. The terror they'd felt that morning seemed like a lifetime ago. They were clean. They were fed. They were warm. They were safe. And they had absolutely no idea what to do with any of it. Helga couldn't sleep. She lay on her back, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the breathing of the women around her. Some were already asleep, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the day. Others were crying softly into their pillows. A voice drifted through the darkness, asking the question that was on everyone's mind. Why are they being so kind to us? What do they want? No one had an answer. Outside, the night was quiet. No bombs, no artillery, no screaming, just crickets, and the distant sound of guards walking their rounds. It was the most peaceful night most of them had experienced in years. And somehow, that peace was more unsettling than any violence could have been. The days that followed settled into a rhythm the women could never have imagined. Each morning began with a bell at 6 a.m., not the harsh clang of a prison alarm, but a simple wake-up call that gave them time to rise, wash, and dress before breakfast. The washing facilities had running water, both hot and cold, a luxury that seemed almost miraculous. Breakfast was served in the mess hall: oatmeal with sugar and milk, scrambled eggs, real eggs from real chickens, toast with butter and jam, orange juice, something most of them hadn't tasted in half a decade, and coffee with cream. The abundance was almost painful. Some women could barely eat, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle such rich food after months of starvation. Others ate everything they could get, hoarding bread rolls in their pockets out of fear that the food might suddenly stop coming. After breakfast came work assignments. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war could be asked to perform labor, but the work had to be safe and compensated. The American military took this seriously. The women were assigned to various duties around the camp. Some worked in laundries, washing and pressing American uniforms. Others worked in kitchens, helping to prepare the very meals they would later eat. Some were assigned to agricultural work, picking crops in nearby fields. A few with secretarial skills were given clerical tasks, typing reports, filing documents. The work wasn't difficult. In fact, compared to what many of them had done during the war, operating searchlights during bombing raids, working 12-hour shifts in munitions factories, typing orders while buildings shook from explosions, it was almost relaxing. And they were paid for it. Small amounts of camp script that could be used at the canteen, but payment nonetheless. The concept was baffling. They were prisoners. Why were they being paid? The canteen itself was another source of wonder. Located in a small building near the barracks, it sold items that had become almost mythical during the war years. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, chewing gum, soap, shampoo, lipstick, magazines with pictures of American movie stars. The women would stand before the shelves and stare, unable to believe that such things still existed in the world. Helga bought a small notebook and a pencil. She'd been keeping a diary on scraps of paper, writing in margins and on the backs of old documents. Now she had a proper place to record her thoughts. She wrote every night, trying to capture the strangeness of her new existence. We wake at 6 a.m. We eat breakfast that would have fed my family for a week. We work. We eat lunch. We work more. We eat dinner. We sleep in clean beds. We are prisoners, but we live better than free Germans do right now. The irony is unbearable. The contrast between their comfortable captivity and the suffering of their homeland became harder to ignore with each passing day. Letters began to arrive from Germany, smuggled through Red Cross channels and official prisoner mail. The news they carried was devastating. One woman received word that her parents' home in Cologne had been destroyed in the final bombing raids. Her mother was living in a cellar, sharing space with 3 other families, eating whatever scraps could be found in the rubble. Her father was missing, presumed dead. "Please," her mother wrote, "if you have food, send some. We are starving." Another woman learned that her younger sister, only 16, had been assaulted by Soviet soldiers when they overran her village in the east. The family had fled west with nothing but the clothes on their backs. "We dream of bread," her sister wrote. "Do you remember what bread tastes like?" Helga received a letter from her mother in Munich. The city had been heavily bombed in the final months of the war. Her childhood home was gone. Her mother was living with distant relatives in the countryside, working on their farm in exchange for food and shelter. "We eat potato peels and dandelion greens. The Americans have given us nothing. Perhaps you are better off in their prison than we are in our freedom." The letter shattered something inside Helga. Her mother was starving, while she ate beef stew and chocolate cake. Her mother was scrounging for potato peels while she bought lipstick at the canteen. The guilt was overwhelming. Throughout the barracks, women sat with their letters and wept. They read aloud the words of mothers and sisters and friends, sharing the collective grief of a nation in ruins. Germany was starving. Germany was broken. And here they sat, the enemy's prisoners, living better than they had ever lived under the Reich. The Americans watched this with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. They knew what was happening in Germany. They'd seen the destruction themselves, march through the bombed cities, witness the desperate refugees clogging the roads. Some guards tried to offer comfort, passing extra food to the women or looking the other way when they tried to save portions from their meals to send home. Others kept their distance, unsure how to respond to grief that was so raw and so complicated. There was a particular cruelty in the contrast that the women couldn't escape. Every morning they woke to abundant breakfasts while their families searched rubble for scraps. Every evening they fell asleep in clean beds while their mothers shivered in cellars. Every day, the gap between their comfortable captivity and the suffering of their homeland grew wider. Some women stopped eating, not because they weren't hungry, but because the guilt was too overwhelming. They couldn't bear the thought of gaining weight, of growing healthy while their families starved. The American medics noticed and intervened, gently encouraging them to eat, explaining that they needed their strength, that starving themselves would help no one. But logic did nothing to ease the emotional burden. One evening, a young American medic found Helga sitting alone behind the barracks, crying over her mother's letter. He didn't speak German, and she spoke only a little English, but he sat down beside her anyway. He offered her a cigarette. She took it. They sat in silence for a long time, smoking and watching the sunset over the barbed wire fence. Before he left, he pressed something into her hand. A chocolate bar. "For you," he said. "For Sad." It was such a small gesture. Such a human gesture. And it broke Helga's heart more than any cruelty could have. The contradiction gnawed at them constantly. How could the enemy be so kind while their own nation had left them with nothing? As weeks turned into months, small human connections began to form across the divide of language and history. The American guards and medics weren't monsters. They were young men, most of them, far from home and tired of war. Some had lost friends and brothers fighting the Germans. Others had seen horrors in the concentration camps that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But face to face with these exhausted, frightened women, many found it impossible to maintain hatred. There was Private Johnson, a farm boy from Iowa, who spent his breaks teaching English words to a group of curious German women. He would point to objects and say the word slowly, laughing when they mangled the pronunciation. "Tree," he would say, pointing. "Tree," the women would repeat, and everyone would laugh. It was such a simple thing, but it was human. It was normal. It was a reminder that life could be more than war and death. There was Sergeant Miller, a gruff man from New York who'd lost his brother at Anzio and had every reason to hate Germans. But when he discovered that one of the prisoners had been a music teacher before the war, he found an old guitar and brought it to her. She played German folk songs in the evenings, and sometimes the American guards would gather outside the barracks to listen, their faces soft with homesickness and memory. There was Nurse Williams, an American woman from Ohio, who'd volunteered to help process the female prisoners. She went beyond her duties, organizing a small library of donated books, teaching basic first aid, simply listening when the women needed to talk. She didn't understand most of what they said, but she understood grief and fear and exhaustion. She understood humanity. One evening, Nurse Williams sat with a group of German women who were trying to learn English. She pointed to things and said the words slowly: window, door, table, chair. The women repeated after her, their German accents making the English words sound strange and musical. They laughed at their own mistakes. They laughed at each other. And for a few moments, they weren't prisoners and captors. They were just people trying to communicate, trying to understand each other. There was also Corporal Davis, a black American soldier from Alabama who worked in the camp's supply depot. The German women had never seen a black person before, except in the racist caricatures of Nazi propaganda. They'd been taught that black people were inferior, dangerous, primitive. But Corporal Davis was none of those things. He was quiet, dignified, kind. He always had a smile for the women who came to collect supplies. He spoke to them with respect, even though they'd been raised to despise him. One day, a young German woman dropped a box of supplies she was carrying, items scattered across the ground. She fell to her knees to gather them, face burning with embarrassment. Corporal Davis knelt beside her and helped, his large hands gentle as he picked up soap bars and packages of bandages. When they'd gathered everything, He smiled at her and said something in English that she didn't understand. But his tone was warm. His eyes were kind. And something inside her shifted. "He's not what they told us," she said later to Helga. "None of them are what they told us." Helga found herself assigned to work in the camp's small medical clinic, assisting the American medics with basic tasks, folding bandages, sterilizing instruments, translating for German patients. The work brought her into daily contact with Americans, and slowly her terror of them began to fade. They weren't demons. They weren't the savage beasts that Nazi propaganda had described. They were just people. Flawed, complicated, sometimes kind, and sometimes cruel, but fundamentally human. One day she was helping to treat an American soldier who'd cut his hand badly on a piece of equipment. As she bandaged the wound, their eyes met. "Thank you," he said in German, the words clumsy but sincere. "Danke." "You speak German?" she asked, surprised. "A little," he admitted. "My grandmother was from Stuttgart. She used to make apple strudel and tell me stories about the old country." He paused, looking down at his bandaged hand. "I never thought I'd end up here fighting against people like her." The moment was brief, but it lingered in Helga's mind for days. An American soldier whose grandmother was German. A grandmother who made apple strudel. The world was so much more complicated than she'd been taught to believe. The enemy wasn't a faceless mass of evil. The enemy was someone's grandson. Every interaction, every kind word, every shared cigarette, chipped away at the wall of fear and hatred that had been built inside them for years. The ideological transformation didn't happen all at once. It crept up slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark horizon. For years, these women had been fed a steady diet of Nazi propaganda. They'd been told that Germans were the master race, destined to rule over inferior peoples. They'd been told that the war was a righteous struggle against Jewish conspiracies and Bolshevik tyranny. They'd been told that the Americans were degenerates, mongrels, barbarians who would destroy everything good and pure about German civilization. But now, they were living among these supposed barbarians. And everything they'd been told was turning out to be a lie. The Americans weren't degenerates. They were organized, efficient, surprisingly humane. Their military was powerful not because they were brutal, but because they were wealthy, well-supplied, and genuinely believed in what they were fighting for. They didn't beat prisoners. They didn't starve them. They followed rules, laws, conventions that the Reich had long ago abandoned. One day, the women were taken outside the camp for a work detail in a nearby town. They rode in the back of trucks through American-controlled territory, and what they saw through the canvas flaps shook them to their core. The town was intact. Untouched by bombs. Houses stood in neat rows with flowers in window boxes. Shops displayed goods in their windows. Children played in the streets, laughing, their cheeks round and healthy. Cars drove past, shiny and new. People walked on sidewalks dressed in clean clothes, carrying bags full of groceries. It was like stepping into another world, a world of peace and plenty that seemed almost imaginary after years of war. "This is how they live," one woman whispered, her face pressed against the truck's canvas. "This is what we were fighting against." No one answered. What could they say? The Reich had promised them a 1,000-year empire, a world of German dominance and glory. Instead, it had given them rubble and starvation. The Americans, the enemy, the degenerates, lived in a paradise that Germans could only dream of. The internal conflict was agonizing. How could they reconcile what they were seeing with what they'd believed? How could they accept that everything they'd sacrificed for, everything they'd done, had been in service of a lie? Some women retreated into denial, insisting that what they were seeing was a trick, a facade designed to demoralize them. Others fell into despair, unable to cope with the magnitude of their disillusionment. Helga struggled with questions that kept her awake at night. Had she been wrong about everything? Had the Reich been wrong? If the Americans weren't monsters, then why had Germany fought them? If the war had been built on lies, then what had all those deaths been for? What had her service been for? She wrote in her diary, "I'm beginning to hate myself for what I believed. I'm beginning to hate my country for what it made me believe. And I'm beginning to hate this kindness, because it shows me how wrong I was. The barracks became a place of quiet debate and painful confession. At night, when the lights were out and the guards couldn't hear, the women talked. They shared their doubts, their fears, their growing horror at the world they were discovering. "I heard what they found in the camps," whispered one woman, a former secretary who'd worked near Berlin. "The concentration camps. They say there were thousands of bodies. Millions. They say, we killed them. Our people killed them." "That's Allied propaganda," replied another woman sharply. "They want us to feel guilty so they can justify what they did to our cities." "Is it propaganda?" the first woman pressed. "I saw photographs. The Americans showed photographs. Piles of bodies. Walking skeletons. Children." Her voice broke. "How can that be propaganda?" The silence that followed was heavy with horror and denial. Some women refused to believe. They couldn't believe. To accept the truth of the camps would mean accepting that they'd been complicit in something monstrous. Others wept silently, the truth settling over them like a shroud. Not everyone wrestled with these questions. Some women clung to their beliefs with desperate intensity, insisting that Germany had been right, that the war had been necessary, that the enemy was still the enemy regardless of how they treated prisoners. These women formed their own small groups, whispering among themselves, refusing to engage with those who were beginning to doubt. One such woman, a former military nurse named Gerda, confronted Helga one evening in the barracks. "You're becoming soft," she hissed. "You're letting them manipulate you. This kindness is a weapon. They want to destroy our pride, our identity, and you're letting them." Helga looked at her for a long moment. "And what did our pride give us, Gerda? What did our identity bring us? Ruins, starvation, millions dead. Perhaps a little softness wouldn't be such a terrible thing." Goethe's face flushed with anger. "You're a traitor to Germany." "Maybe," Helga replied quietly. "Or maybe I'm finally seeing clearly for the first time in my life." The confrontation stayed with her for days. Was she a traitor? Was she betraying everything she'd believed by allowing herself to see the Americans as human? Or was the real betrayal the lies she'd been told, the hatred she'd been taught, the blindness that had been forced upon her since childhood? For most of the women, the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The kindness of the Americans, the abundance of their society, the photographs from the camps, the letters from home describing a Germany in ruins. Piece by piece, the edifice of Nazi belief was crumbling. And there was nothing to replace it except confusion and grief. The Americans, intentionally or not, were teaching the women something profound. Not through lectures or propaganda, but through simple daily interactions. They were teaching them about human dignity. The Reich had taught that some people were worth more than others, that Germans were superior, that Jews, Slavs, Roma, the disabled, and countless others were subhuman, worthy only of exploitation or extermination. The entire Nazi system was built on this hierarchy of human worth. But the Americans treated everyone the same. German prisoners, American soldiers, black troops, white troops. They followed rules that applied to everyone. They believed in rights that belonged to all people, not just the privileged few. It was a fundamentally different way of seeing the world. One evening, the camp organized a film showing. The prisoners were allowed to watch an American movie, a romantic comedy that seemed impossibly light and frivolous after years of war. But what struck the women most wasn't the film itself. It was the fact that they were being allowed to watch it at all. The enemy was sharing its culture with them. The enemy was treating them like people who deserved entertainment, not just labor. After the film, Helga sat in the darkness of the barracks and thought about what she'd seen. Not just the movie, but everything. The warm baths, the soap, the food, the clean beds, the work that was compensated, the small kindnesses of individual Americans. All of it added up to something she was only beginning to understand. If the enemy values our lives, why didn't we value theirs? If they can see us as human beings worthy of dignity, why couldn't we see them the same way? She wrote in her diary, "Perhaps we were the monsters all along. Perhaps the Reich was the monster, and we were its willing servants." It was a devastating realization, but it was also the beginning of something new. For the first time, Helga was thinking for herself, questioning the beliefs she'd been given, forming her own understanding of the world. The warm bath that had seemed so strange on her first day in captivity had washed away more than dirt. It had begun to wash away years of indoctrination. The transformation became undeniable the day Helga looked in a mirror and didn't recognize herself. 3 months had passed since her arrival at the camp. 3 months of regular meals, clean water, medical care, and rest. 3 months of slowly rebuilding a body that had been broken by war and starvation. And now, standing in front of the small mirror in the washing facility, she saw the results. Her face had filled out. The hollow cheeks that had made her look like a skeleton were gone, replaced by smooth curves. Her skin had color again, a healthy pink instead of the gray pallor of malnutrition. Her hair, which had been thin and brittle, was now thick and shiny from regular washing with American shampoo. She looked healthy. She looked alive. She looked almost beautiful. And it broke her, because this transformation had happened in an enemy prison camp. Because her body had been restored by people she'd been taught to hate. Because while she was becoming healthy again, her family was starving in the ruins of Germany. Because the Reich had promised her glory and given her nothing, while the enemy had promised her nothing and given her everything. She stood there, staring at her reflection, and felt the last walls inside her crumble. All the beliefs she'd held, all the certainties that had defined her world, collapsed into dust. She was not who she thought she was. Germany was not what she thought it was. The enemy was not what she thought they were. Everything was different. Everything was upside down. She began to cry. Not soft, quiet tears, but deep, racking sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the lies she'd believed. She cried for the years she'd wasted serving a cause that was monstrous. She cried for her family suffering while she grew fat on American food. She cried for Germany, destroyed by its own madness. She cried for the people who died in the camps, people she'd never known, but whose deaths she now understood she shared responsibility for. An American nurse found her there, collapsed on the floor of the washing facility, sobbing uncontrollably. The nurse didn't understand what had happened. She didn't speak German well enough to ask, but she knelt down beside Helga and held her, rocking her gently like a child, making soft, soothing sounds. "It's okay," the nurse whispered, even though she knew Helga couldn't understand. "It's okay. Whatever it is, it's okay. You're safe now. You're going to be okay." Helga clung to her and wept. She wept until she had no tears left. And when she finally stopped, when she finally pulled away and looked at the American woman who'd held her, she saw something that completed her transformation. She saw kindness. Simple, uncomplicated human kindness. From an enemy. From someone who had every reason to hate her, but who chose compassion instead. That night, Helga wrote the most important entry in her diary. "They told us the Americans were beasts. They told us we would be degraded and destroyed. Instead, they gave us warm baths and held us when we cried. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I believe. But I know this. Hatred is easy. It's so easy to hate. But what they've shown me, this kindness, this dignity, it's so much harder. It demands that I see them as human. And if they're human, then we were wrong. We were so terribly wrong about everything." As autumn turned to winter, rumors began to spread through the camp. The war had been over for months now. The processing of prisoners was nearly complete. Soon they would be sent home. Home. The word should have filled them with joy. Instead, it filled them with dread. What was home now? Their cities were ruins. Their families were scattered and starving. The country they'd known no longer existed. Germany was divided, occupied, broken. There was nothing to go back to except rubble and grief. But there was something else, too. Something harder to admit. Many of the women were afraid to leave the camp. Afraid to give up the regular meals, the clean beds, the safety of American protection. In captivity, they had everything they needed. In freedom, they would have nothing. The thought of returning to hunger was almost unbearable. They'd spent months rebuilding their bodies, recovering from years of deprivation. Their cheeks had filled out. Their hair had regained its shine. Their energy had returned. Now they would go back to potato peels and dandelion soup. They would watch their bodies waste away again. And this time, they would know what they were missing. There was also the question of what they would tell people. How could they explain what had happened to them? How could they describe the kindness of the Americans to families who'd lost everything to American bombs? How could they share their transformation with people who still believed the old propaganda? "I'm afraid to go back," Helga confessed to another woman one night. "I'm afraid of what I'll find. I'm afraid of being hungry again. I'm afraid of—" She paused, struggling to articulate her deepest fear. "I'm afraid of who I'll become." The other woman nodded slowly. "I understand. Here. We're changing. We're becoming something new. But out there, in the ruins, surrounded by people who still believe the old lies, will we be strong enough to hold on to what we've learned?" It was a question none of them could answer. The day of departure came on a cold December morning. The women gathered in the camp's central square, their few possessions packed into small bags they'd been given. The Americans had provided them with winter coats, sturdy shoes, and packages of food for the journey. More kindness. More impossible kindness. Helga stood in line, waiting for her name to be called. She looked around at the camp that had been her home for 7 months. The barracks where she'd slept. The mess hall where she'd eaten. The medical clinic where she'd worked. The washing facility where she'd broken down and been reborn. She'd entered this place as one person, and was leaving as another. The American medic who'd given her the chocolate bar was there, helping to organize the departure. Their eyes met across the crowd. He smiled, and raised his hand in a small wave. She smiled back, her eyes filling with tears. There was so much she wanted to say to him. "Thank you. I'm sorry. You changed my life. You showed me what it means to be human." But the words wouldn't come. And the moment passed. The journey home was long and difficult. Trains that barely ran. Roads cratered by bombs. Cities that were nothing but piles of rubble. The Germany they passed through was a ghost of itself. A nightmare landscape of destruction and despair. Refugees wandered the roads, hollow-eyed and hungry. Children begged for food. Old women picked through garbage. It was worse than they'd imagined. It was worse than they'd feared. When Helga finally reached Munich, she found her mother living in a single room in a bombed-out building. Her mother was thin, gray, aged beyond her years. She looked at Helga with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "You look well," her mother said, and there was something in her voice that might have been accusation. "The Americans fed you well." "They did," Helga admitted. "They were kind to us." Her mother was silent for a long moment. Then she turned away and began to prepare what passed for dinner. A thin soup made from potato peels and a few scraps of vegetables. Helga didn't know what to say. How could she explain what she'd experienced? How could she share the transformation she'd undergone? Her mother was still living in the ruins of the old world. Helga had seen something new. Years later, when Germany had rebuilt itself and the war had faded into history, Helga would tell her children and grandchildren about her time in American captivity. Not the fear and suffering of the war years, but what came after. The warm baths, the soap, the food, the kindness of enemies who had every reason to be cruel. "They didn't have to treat us that way," she would say. "We were their enemies. We'd done terrible things. Our country had done terrible things. And yet, They gave us dignity. They showed us that there was another way to live, another way to treat people. She kept her diary all her life. It became a record not just of her experiences, but of her transformation. The frightened young woman who'd entered the processing center expecting death. The broken woman who'd wept on the floor of the washing facility. The changed woman who'd walked out of that camp with a new understanding of the world. In the decades that followed, Helga became an advocate for reconciliation. She spoke at schools and community centers about her experiences. She corresponded with American veterans who'd served in the occupation. She even traveled to the United States once, in 1985, to visit the site where the processing center had once stood. It was a shopping mall now, surrounded by parking lots and fast food restaurants. But she stood there for a long time, remembering. "The Americans broke me," she would tell her grandchildren, "but not in the way I expected. They broke my hatred. They broke my certainty. They broke all the lies I'd believed, and in breaking me, they freed me." Other women from the camp had similar stories. Some had kept their experiences private, unable to explain to families who'd suffered so much. Others had shared their transformations openly, becoming voices for understanding in a nation struggling to come to terms with its past. A few had married American soldiers and moved to the United States, building new lives in the land of the former enemy. What does it mean when your enemy shows you more kindness than your own nation? That question had haunted Helga for the rest of her life, but slowly, over the years, she came to understand the answer. It means that kindness is stronger than hatred. It means that dignity is more powerful than degradation. It means that the way you treat people matters, even people who've been taught to hate you. Especially those people. The warm bath that had seemed so strange on her first day in captivity had washed away more than dirt. It had washed away years of poison. And in its place, something new had grown. Something fragile and precious. Something that looked a lot like hope. And so the warm bath became more than water and soap. It became a symbol of something deeper. A reminder that even in the aftermath of the most terrible war in human history, kindness was possible. That enemies could become something like friends. That the chains of hatred could be broken by simple acts of human dignity. For those German women, the Helferinnen, who'd served the Wehrmacht and expected to die at American hands, the memory of those warm baths would last a lifetime. The steam rising around them, the soap that smelled like flowers, the gentle hands of medics who could have been cruel but chose to be kind. These were the images that would stay with them long after the war had faded into history. They went home to a broken country and rebuilt their lives. They married, had children, grew old. Some never spoke of the war again. Others, like Helga, made sure the story was told. Because it was a story that mattered. A story about what happens when hatred meets kindness. A story about the power of dignity. As Helga told her granddaughter many years later, they could have broken us with cruelty. They could have made us hate them even more. Instead, they broke us with kindness. And kindness, I learned, is so much harder to resist. It demands that you see the enemy as human. And once you do that, once you see their humanity, you can never quite hate them the same way again. And that is the story worth remembering. Not just as history, but as a lesson. A lesson about the power of how we treat each other. A lesson about what kindness can accomplish when hatred seems easier. A lesson that's just as relevant today as it was in the spring of 1945. If you found this story powerful and meaningful, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us that even in the darkest times, humanity can survive. And sometimes, it's the smallest acts of kindness that change the world.